Pues vamos a comenzar con la presentación. We're going to start with the presentation of and dialogue between David Dalton and Marissa K. Lopez, and I'm going to present them both. This is about David's upcoming book, Robo Sacer, Necroliberalism and Cyborg Resistance in Mexican and Chicanx Dystopias. David Dalton is an associate professor of Spanish and director of Latin American studies at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. His research theorizes the interface of science, technology, and the body, and how this contributes to racial and gender hierarchies in Mexico and throughout Latin America. He is the author of Mestizo Modernity, Race, Technology, and the Body in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, and Robo Sacer, coming out in April of 2023. He has also edited several books and special editions in journals. These include Healthcare in Latin America, History, Society, Culture. Has that come out yet?
Yeah.
Okay.
That came out in August.
Okay, it came out in August. Imagining Latinidad, Digital Diasporas and Public Engagement Among Latin American Migrants. El Cine de Luchadores, The Transatlantic Undead, Zombies in Hispanic and Luso-Brazilian Literatures. And he has written some 30 articles in book chapters on different aspects of Mexican and Latin American studies. And Marissa is going to dialogue with him, and she is an associate graduate dean and professor of English and Chicana studies at UCLA, researching Chicanx literature from the 19th century to the present, with an emphasis on 19th century Mexican California. She has written 2 books, Chicano Nations from 2011, which is about nationalism in Chicanx literature from the early 1800s to post 9/11. And Racial Imminence from 2019 explores uses of the body and affect in Chicanx cultural production. She recently completed a year-long residency at the Los Angeles Public Library as a Scholars in Society Fellow with the American Council of Learned Societies, where she learned to collaboratively develop an app. The app called Picturing Mexican America, that uses geodata to display images of Mexican California relevant to a user's location. Very interesting. So we will begin the presentation, I believe, with Marissa. Yeah. Oh no, I'm sorry. We're actually presenting. My apologies. We're starting with David, okay, who is going to present the book right before we get the reaction to the book. Yeah, it makes much more sense. Yeah.
We can do it however, right? So I decided that I would basically take the introduction of the book and distill it down to its purest form, and just really get out the theoretical arguments. So there's not going to be as many close readings, but it's more of just kind of a theoretical arguments that buttress the chapters of the book. So without further ado, I will start. On April 28th, 2020, during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, Donald Trump signed Executive Order 13917, which required meatpacking factories to remain open, quote, to ensure a continued supply of protein for Americans, close quote. It really says that. Tellingly, the order remains silent on how meatpacking plants should protect their workers. Rather, the executive order codified the devaluation of meatpackers' health and lives, marking them as expendable cyborgs whose value extended no further than their function in operating industrial machinery to produce food for listeners. The dehumanization of meatpackers throughout the country reflected in large part their legal status. Most were undocumented workers from countries like Mexico. They lacked citizenship claims that would have allowed them to more effectively contest the dangerous working conditions that corporate and government policies had imposed upon them. So Giorgio Agamben provides particularly useful language to examining the U.S. response to COVID-19 through his theorization of bios and Zoe. Yes, I know that Giorgio Agamben is an anti-vaxxer, but his theory still holds true. Bios refers to the fully human Aristotelian good life that entails political autonomy. Zoe, a term that forms the root of zoology, refers to those whose lives exist outside the political sphere. During states of exception, the sovereign interpolates the Zoe into Homo Sacer beings who can be killed but not murdered or sacrificed because society extends no value or no human value to their bare lives. Most onlookers would probably have correctly identified public health as an important state of exception that world leaders sought to protect as they confronted the virus. Nevertheless, as the actions and statements of many government leaders across the world made clear, the drive to maintain commerce represented an even deeper institutionalized state of exception. One of the things that most drew my attention during the early stages of the pandemic was the extent to which government policies resembled those of the works that I had been studying and working on for this book. It was really creepy. This book discusses how dystopian fictions from Greater Mexico aid us in theorizing contemporary biopolitics on both sides of the US-Mexico border during the neoliberal period. It is perhaps telling that Chicanx and Mexican literary and cultural producers imagine an array of forms of resistance predicated on rethinking humanity's and the body's relationship with technology. On the one hand, Robo Sacer highlights how technologies of production play a key role in casting Mexican and Chicanx workers as mere extensions of a dehumanizing capitalist machine. On the other hand, however, the book also shows how technology provides an avenue of resistance by allowing marginalized individuals and communities to seize a political voice and advocate for themselves. Some readers may find the juxtaposition of Mexican and Chicanx dystopian fictions problematic, given the tensions that have existed between these communities since at least the early part of the 20th century. Nevertheless, a shared solidarity has also developed in recent years. You know, I'm thinking about like Faggot Boss, right? Some of those illustriously bad papers. But a shared solidarity has also developed in recent years as increased migration under NAFTA has put Mexican and Chicanx communities into greater contact than ever before. The Mexican government, for example, has undertaken steps to strengthen its ties with its diaspora. Certainly, we should recognize the distinctive social and political context that exists on both sides of the US-Mexico border. But we also should note the shared struggles that these greater Mexican communities face as they navigate a world dominated by US-sponsored and particularly Anglo-US-sponsored neoliberalism. Perhaps one of the most enduring similarities between Mexican and Chicanx populations is a perpetual construct of foreignness from the imperial center that justifies the continued economic exploitation of both. So this book seeks to avoid the pitfalls of essentialist readings that view multiculturalism through what Marissa Lopez calls quote unquote neoliberal aesthetics that would depoliticize racial difference by ignoring its socioeconomic implications. Rather, my analysis reverberates with her call for critical discussions of race to focus on quote material inequalities, close quote, rather than simply quote representational otherness, close quote. And that's from Racial Eminence. The works discussed in Robo Sacer foreground how global capital interfaces with people's biopolitical status on both sides of the border. So throughout this book, I define Robo Sacer as a cyborg articulation of Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer. The works that I analyze suggest that unbalanced access to technology relegates Mexican and Chicanx individuals to a technologically bare existence. As such, the role of technology perpetuating an oppressive social order proves key. The book's most important intervention centers around the potential for Robo Sacer resistance, which occurs when oppressed individuals and communities employ technologies of domination in subversive ways that reject the reigning biopolitics. Given the nature of the study, I necessarily apply a broad definition that postulates cyborg as any body, human or not, that forms a symbiotic relationship with any sort of technology. So this is, and in this way, this is kind of a sequel to mestizo modernity. Cyborgs could be people who use smartphones and internet, people with prosthetic extensions inserted into their bodies, people who have been vaccinated, or people who use low-tech tools like firearms as metaphorical extensions of themselves. This definition emphasizes how, at its core, cyborg identity proves useful to interrogating different interpolations of the body, particularly those based on gender and sexuality, race, class, and a host of other demarcations tied to embodiment. Technologized bodies often force reconceptualizations of the body that call into question previous understandings of the overriding body politics and biopolitics. This does not mean that cyborg identity necessarily brings about a utopian refashioning of the reigning biopolitics. Rather, emancipation must stem from critical methodology to replace current modes of oppression with strategies of inclusivity. So any successful methodology of Robo Sacer resistance must engage the unequal ties to citizenship that Mexican and Chicanx people face when compared to their more privileged, mostly white North American and European counterparts. Once again, Agamben provides valuable insight. If bios refers to those who live in an Aristotelian good life, imbued with a political voice, then Zoe refers to the subaltern whose weak ties to citizenship strip them of any political voice. Chela Sandoval speaks precisely to this idea through her discussion of cyborg identity as a means to deconstruct the patriarchy and racial oppression. As she argues, all women, particularly women of color, must negotiate a symbolic cyborg subjectivity in their daily lives due to the hybrid nature inherent to their embodied experience. Cyborg identity sparks a type of radical mestizaje in which oppressed individuals recognize their shared marginalization and work together to challenge status quo. Sandoval's view of cyborg politics as intrinsically oppositional sits at the heart of my theorization of Robo Sacer. When Robo Sacer actors take advantage of their ties to technology to speak against oppression, they denaturalize the necroliberal state of exception and coerce repressive forces into acknowledging both their humanity and, crucially, their political voice. This part's highlighted in yellow, so it's kind of like a thesis. If Spivak is correct that the subaltern lose their subalternity when they engage in political discourse, then we should read Robo Sacer resistance as nothing less than a politicization of the Zoe catalyzed through cybernetic communion that facilitates radical mestizaje. That said, Robo Sacer strives to avoid a naive optimism about technology's potential to usher in a new liberated order. Rather, it theorizes the role of technology in creating both modes of oppression and means of resistance in contemporary society. In so doing, it grapples with the questions of whether or not the resistant potential of cyborg politics exists beyond the discursive realm, and it suggests that Robo Sacer resistance provides a powerful means to challenge a dehumanized status quo. If the resistant cyborg functions as the protagonist of this book, then the necroliberal market of death serves as its principal antagonist. The term necroliberalism draws explicitly on Achille Mbembe's groundbreaking theorization of necropolitics as, quote, the trajectories by which the state of exception and the relation of enmity have become the normative basis of the right to kill. In such instances, power, which is not necessarily state power, continuously refers and appeals to exception, emergency, and fictionalized enemies. So numerous scholars have noted that Mbembe develops a theory of power that applies especially well to the so-called third world. Indeed, Mbembe asserts that technology or robotically adjusted life plays an integral role in beating out death upon the killable. The Cameroonian theorist signals two key breaks with Agamben. Firstly, the right to kill, far from a byproduct of the desire to uphold the bios at the expense of the Zoe, becomes the central tenet of political power. Secondly, his understanding of necropolitics causes him to identify institutions beyond the state, such as the market, that can exert power over life and death. The degree to which cyborg subjectivity interfaces with the biopolitical and necropolitical context becomes clear in light of Mbembe's assertion that during the age of neoliberalism, quote, it is no longer certain that the human person is very distinct from the object, the animal, or the machine, close quote. So on its surface, this sounds a lot like Donna Haraway, right? When she famously deconstructs human animal machine ontologies of ages past. That said, the thinkers frame these deconstructions in antithetical ways. For Haraway, this juxtaposition has decentered the primacy of the human and allowed us to foreground the experiences of both the non-human and the dehumanized. Mbembe, however, views this deconstruction as the result of a neoliberal ideology that commodifies bodies, viewing them only in terms of consumption. So Robo Sacer largely agrees with Mbembe's take, though its optimism ultimately lies in the belief that cyborg activism can follow kind of in the path of heroin. So beyond its clear invocation of necropolitics, the term necroliberalism also is a useful play on words that looks and reads very similarly to neoliberalism. The discourse underlying major free trade agreements like NAFTA. The NAFTA negotiations provide one of the clearest windows into the thinking that characterized the expendability of the entire greater Mexican population. The negotiators spent significant time discussing the rights of corporations, the movements of goods, and so forth, across borders. But the final agreement remains silent on the free transit of labor, to the point that many economists like Kevin Johnson, they go as far as asserting that US officials seem to fail to see the connection between free trade and migration. NAFTA thus normalized the free flow of goods, even as it refused to codify a means through which people could legally move between countries, as free trade invariably disrupted their economies. Far from creating programs to help Mexican peasants who lost their jobs as a result of NAFTA, or Lopez, US policymakers instead militarized the border with a focus on blocking major immigration hubs in major cities like San Diego, El Paso, etc. Nogales. NAFTA codified distinctions between bios and zoe by marking Mexican bodies as expendable vessels meant to produce and consume in the global economy. Displaced indigenous migrants played an especially important role in this process. They migrated not only to the United States, but also to cities like Ciudad Juarez, where they would provide maquiladora labor that elites hoped to spread across the Mexican side of the border region. These same workers would further fuel Mexican modernity by using their wages to spend in national and global markets. As marginalized individuals took on work in these sweatshops, they became literal cyborgs. The femicide machine talks about this. It uses cyborg theory very explicitly to talk about feminicide in Ciudad Juarez, for example. Global capitalists ceased to view them as human in a legal and economic sense, instead viewing them as cogs in the machine of the global economy. If one died while producing inexpensive trinkets for international consumers, then another person would quickly take their place. And that's something that I talk about in depth in chapter 4. Despite promises of a utopian entrance into modernity, the implementation of NAFTA had produced a dehumanizing dystopia. Mexican and Chicanx literary and cultural producers thus began to question different tenets of the new economic order through an array of creative expressions. So on dystopia, the dystopian fictions that I discussed throughout this book challenge different utopian narratives whose pernicious underbellies have proven disastrous in Mexican and Chicanx circles. The main utopia that these dystopian fictions deconstruct is that of NAFTA and the neoliberal order. That said, they also critique exclusionary articulations of mestizaje and the patriarchal hegemony that permeated much of post-revolutionary Mexican thought and particularly the early parts of the Chicano movement. The dystopian fictions discussed in this book prove especially valuable as they denaturalize, regardless of the source, acritical utopian narratives of progress. Perhaps the single most prevalent utopian discourse that they confront is NAFTA. On its face, NAFTA embodied many ideals of left-leaning governments throughout the Americas as it heralded a hitherto unprecedented level of regional integration. It is for this reason that an array of business leaders and academics welcomed the agreement with the hope that it would lead to Mexican and Latin American modernity. Most, though certainly not all, of the dystopian fictions discussed in this book came in the form of science fiction or other fantastic genres or modes. And I'm using the International Association for the Fantastic and the Arts' very broad definition of fantastic here. I don't want to get into the wheels and fantastic, we talk about in our Latin American courses. Fantastic here could be science fiction, fantasy, all of those things. So in many ways, these traditions reverberate with Mbembe's characterization of Afrofuturism, which I find really valuable. He describes Afrofuturism as a literary, aesthetic, and cultural movement that emerged during the second half of the 20th century. It combines science fiction, reflections on technology and its relations with Black cultures, magic realism, and non-European cosmologies, with the aim of interrogating the past of the so-called colored peoples and their condition in the present, close quote. Central to Mbembe's observation is the fact that Afrofuturism and other related traditions does not conform to the generic demands of so-called Western literature and cultural studies. Indeed, one could argue that the aesthetic rupture among science fiction, magical realism, horror, and other related genres is a necessary component to the movement's overall rejection of Western humanism as ideology. As Afrofuturism, and one could add Chicanx futurism, Chicana futurism, Latin American speculative fiction, as these genres break with generic divisions opposed by the colonial center, they create new methodologies for imagining alliances to challenge imperial mindsets and structures of power. One especially important utopian narrative entered the official Chicano imaginary in 1969 when a group of activists met in Denver, very close to where I grew up, to pen El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán. The manifesto identified the U.S. Southwest broadly and perhaps conveniently defined to include all of the territories taken by the United States following the Mexican-American War and the Texas Revolution as the mythic land of Aztlán, the ancient homeland of the Mexica. Throughout the late 1960s and the 1970s, Chicano activists, both men and women, deliberately tied their presence in the U.S. Southwest to this mythic past, thus asserting themselves as the ancestral heirs to those lands. It was a very powerful discourse. During the 1980s, an array of queer and female Chicana activists began to question the ideological underpinnings that frequently withheld Chicanas from Chicano discourse. At the same time, these Chicana feminists also pushed back against white feminism, which frequently ignored or even opposed Chicana political interests. Chicana feminism thus emerged as Chicanas interrogated the intersections of race and gender within their communities. And it was from this backdrop that Gloria Anzaldúa posited a particularly queer mestiza consciousness as the means through which Chicanas and Chicanos could reconcile their presence in the United States with their Mexican, Spanish, and mestiza ex and indigenous ancestries. And I said in mestizo modernity, and I'll say it here again, Anzaldúa in a lot of ways Anzaldúa is part of the pedigree, right, that leads us to the Communist Manifesto and heroism. I don't think the Cyborg Manifesto, I don't think would have been the same without Anzaldúa. And Chela Sandoval highlights the deep ties between these thinkers when she notes that Anzaldúa viewed her mestiza utopia as, quote, a science fiction world of possibility born of privilege, oppression, hope, and horror, close quote. So Anzaldúa, she was big on science fiction. Lots of her science fiction wasn't published, but you can get it at the archives at UT Austin. Somebody needs to do work on that. That Anzaldúa would express her mestiza consciousness through a utopian essay or a science fiction inspired essay is especially tantalizing for the project of the book. I've situated Robo Sacer in this exact same conversation to show that dystopian literature provides an especially poignant vantage point from which to view the excesses of late capitalism. Mexican and Chicanx dystopian fictions denaturalize the utopian discourses, as these fictions identify the technobiological processes that continue to marginalize people of Mexican descent on both sides of the border. They also lay the groundwork for a subversive Robo Sacer subject. So that's the end of that part. Do you want me to do just read briefly the abstracts of what the chapters are about so you get that, or do you want to just move forward?
I think so. Good. Yeah.
Abstracts?
Yeah.
Okay. So chapter 1 is called Reimagining the Sanctity of Expendable Life, Necroliberal Markets, and Secularly Holy Cyborgs in Shiri Moraga's Heroes and Saints, and Guillermo del Toro's Cronos. This chapter discusses how the neoliberal shift posed threats to Mexican and Chicanx lives even prior to the implementation of NAFTA. If Agamben's Homo Sacer's sacral nature, that is a tongue twister, results from its killability, which becomes the means through which the state builds its own sovereignty, then the Robo Sacer subjects of these fictions draw their sanctity from their ties to folk Catholicism and foment rebellion. Produced during the early stages of the NAFTA negotiations in 1992, both works show the misgivings that Mexican and Chicanx speakers felt about the expansion of free trade. Moraga and Del Toro enunciate their critiques of the necroliberal order through secularly holy cyborg protagonists, Jesus Gris in Cronos, and Cerecita in Heroes and Saints. Each character's ties to the cybernetically sacred denaturalizes societal constructs that relegate them to killable bare life. The murder of these secularly holy cyborgs in both works serves not only to question the dehumanization of the protagonists, but to chip away at the biopolitical underpinnings that would code others as expendable as well. Chapter 2 is called Existing in the Necroliberal Order Online, Robo Sacer Subjectivity in Pepe Rojo's Rio Gris, and Ernest Hogan's Smoking Mirror Blues. And this chapter discusses two narratives that emerged a few years after the passage of NAFTA. Both speculative texts imagine a near future where capitalism has gone from simply tolerating the deaths of the Zoe in its pursuit of profits to a place where death becomes a marketable end in and of itself. Both narratives, greedy television companies broadcast the deaths of Homo sacer subjects on live television in order to increase ratings. The narratives thus imagine a further specialization in necroliberal markets where death itself becomes a lucrative commodity. All people can find themselves interpolated into bare life if a camera captures them in a moment prior to their death. Technology, particularly television broadcasts, plays an integral role in casting the characters of both narratives as killable. Furthermore, the protagonists of these narratives, a young unnamed protagonist in Criollo Gris, and an artificial intelligence rendering of the Aztec god of mischief, Tezcatlipoca, in Smoking Mirror Blues. The novel is a riot. It's very problematic, as we were saying earlier. It's a riot. Can only conceive of effective resistance through the integrated circuit. Ultimately, Rojo and Hogan provide a split verdict about the efficacy of online resistance. Both works suggest that technologies like television and internet provide a powerful space from which to undermine the status quo. Nevertheless, they prove less optimistic about the possibility of establishing a more democratic order. Chapter 3, this is the chapter that the book kind of grew out of, is called Hacking the Bios, Disposable Workers and Bare Life in Rosada Sanchez and Beatriz Pitas, Luna Braceros, and Alex Rivera Sleep Dealer. Engages two speculative fictions that assert that the neoliberal order dehumanizes pan-Latin American populations throughout the hemisphere. In both works, corporate interests align themselves with a necroliberal state that sucks labor and money from migrant workers. Both fictions imagine a necroliberal North American state that uses technological superiority to police and perpetuate its hegemony. Rivera imagines a US-Mexican border region that's marked by a massive wall and drone surveillance. Sanchez and Pita tell of a future nation state called Cali, Texas, that sends the poor to reservations in Fresno and also to lunar labor camps. These works' optimism shines through as the necroliberal state's overdependence on technological superiority in both works opens a space through which dedicated hackers can infiltrate the system and assert their political voice. So these are the most explicitly cyberpunk works that I look, or some call them post-cyberpunk. Chapter 4, favorite, I'll be honest, post-human spectrality, a biopolitics of memory in Carlos Carrera and Sabina Berman's Backyard of Traspatio, and Gabriela Damián Mirabete's Soñarán en el Jardín. Gabriela's here. Discusses the ethics of representation as it pertains to victims of feminicide in Mexico. So I start with Soñarán en el Jardín, which narrates the life of Marissa, a feminist activist who attempts to resurrect victims of feminicide through holograms of the dead that she infuses with public records, family photographs, and social media. The story optimistically alludes to the potential of using avatars and online mobilization as a methodology of the oppressed, through which Mexican women can assert joint kinship against a murderous patriarchy. My reading of the story informs my discussion of Backyard of Patio, a feature film that recreates many of the stories and narratives surrounding the mid-1990s feminicides in Ciudad Juárez. The producers framed the movie as resistant because it drew attention to the serial murder of women. Nevertheless, the film totally uses a slasher aesthetic that evinces its focus on profit over ethics. Beyond problematic shots that seem to fetishize the murdered women's bodies, the film also adopts a slasher morality that blames sexually active women for getting themselves killed. The result is a film of questionable ethics, whose ruminations on Robo Sacer resistance feel like an. My final chapter is called Guns, Narcos, and Low-Tech Cyborgs, Magical Realism, Science Fiction, and the Post-Human in Julio Hernandez Cordon's Company un Revolver, and Rodolfo Anaya's Chupacabra trilogy. And this one builds on Sophie Esch, her characterization of firearms, quote, prostheses for citizenship, close quote, in the Latin American context. And these were both produced in the wake of the devastating drug war that intensified significantly following 2016. So Anaya's trilogy and Hernandez Cordon's film view drug trafficking as a quintessentially necroliberal enterprise that feeds on the life force of Mexican and Chicanx bodies in quest for ever-increasing profits. Anaya is especially heavy-handed. This is like a YA novel, and he talks about people's brains going to mush from the chupacabra sucking out their brains while I'm doing drugs. It's very the fictions articulate violence and weapons in a way that builds on both science fiction and magical realism. On the one hand, armed resistance embodies the resistant potential of Haraway's cyborg as the oppressed use tools meant for their domination to assert their political voice. On the other hand, the use of weapons in both texts plays a central role in enunciating a magical real mode. In Cómprame un Revólver, the director juxtaposes acts of violence with magical real imageries. And for his part, Anaya imagines weapons as talismans that produce a mystical cyborg subjectivity that foments a mestiza X communion with the past. In the end, both works provide a critical commentary about the prevalence of weapons in society, when the only means of resistance is to recreate the very structures of power that have marginalized so many. Structural reform proves all but impossible. That's kind of a low down of the book.
All right. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to all of you up here. That's where you are. Zoom. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks Stephen for inviting me to be here with you this afternoon. Yeah. Well, I want you all to know that when I agreed to do this, I did it purely because the book sounded interesting and I didn't do like funds anymore. I have paperwork. Yeah, I'll totally do that. And I did not realize that I would be so widely excited and so excited at all. So thank you. That was a surprise. Thank you for the work, and I am really glad for the chance to do things. So I have a few things to say about the book and a lot of questions. I might try to truncate this, have more time for conversing. So as you just heard, when you say Robo Sacer and I say Robo Sacer, it's more.
I think that's
okay. I don't. So I'll just keep my way. Robo Sacer is about sort of how technology relationship between the United States and Mexico, while also rendering the borders between these entities more porous. So one of the book's arguments is that these porous geopolitical borders are analogous to the borders of bodily autonomy. So in other words, as technology makes the physical borders between countries increasingly irrelevant, the borders between human body and machine also break down. So in some of the book's case studies, this is the network strategy as true saints, or Guillermo photos from those other times, as in Sonora and Bean, features in chapter 4, the dissolving borders between human and machine offered glimmers of existence. The central question David poses is whether the massive tools forward dismantle the massive house. Can technology, which establishes very strong borders, selling and bios, between those whose bodies fuel the machines of capital and those who live privileged, protected lives fueled by capital, can technology dismantle these categories altogether? Second question of the book, David does not answer. Does not offer a definitive answer, but he does structure this book chronologically and progress. Chapters move through anxious, wide-ranging, extensively researched analyses of texts that proclaim utter doom and gloom, to texts that would suggest that things would maybe kind of sort of get better. And that's the arc of the book. And David ends by noting that the global north still technologically dominates the global south, but we should celebrate the ways in which people use technology to subvert the necroliberal order and advance darkness. And we should attend to cultural productions that illuminate kind of subversion. In this way, I'm quoting, and in this way, he writes, greater Mexican dystopian fictions will continue to call out the biopolitical assumptions that have enabled humanizing necroliberal world, while at the same time imagining ways to create a more just. Now, to be honest, I thought this ended a little satisfying, but I'm not exactly sure how I would have ended the book or how you could have ended it any other way. Unsatisfying only because I wanted an answer. I wanted you to tell me that everything was going to be okay. And so your David's concluding optimism feels a little shaky. So I think the first question that I would start us off with this afternoon is about how optimistic in a minute or in, like 6 minutes. So first, I want to take a little time to let David's ideas breathe a bit and talk about some of the things that I found most useful here. He discusses avenues for further research, conclusion that I want to dwell on the precedent for a little bit more that he wrote back. So Robo Sacer is a play on Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer. That marks for Roman law to denote the person without legal protection. The Zoe, spare life is not the same as the virus or the legal protection. So Robo Sacer is the necropolitical entity whose spare life is created and maintained by technology, the technology that shores up a political economy of death. So the foreign realm must die, in other words, so that the rich might. The multinational phenomenon that provides on-patient order. So let's return to one of the central questions of David's book. If technology prescribes the Robo Sacer to bear life, can we leverage technology to subvert the necropolitical order? The answer depends, such an English professor would say. I think the answer depends on what we mean by technology, but we didn't do that. So David works with an elastic definition, which you heard lots of things fall under the terms umbrella. And that might raise some weirdly eyebrows, but I'm totally on board because it reminds me of the distinction that Martin Heidegger makes in the question concerning technology between revealing and inframing as the essential functions of technology. Heidegger is one of the very few thinkers who doesn't appear in your amazingly vast bibliography. So I feel like I'm making a real contribution to the conversation. So bear with me a little bit. So in the question concerning technology, Heidegger tries to articulate sequence it. It says it in German, but I don't read German. So if he's doing this in order to, quote, prepare a relation to it, in order to not be controlled by it. So technology, he describes technology as a bringing forth, a way of being that brings humans closer to a truth. So Heidegger links then technology in this sense directly to poiesis, make, and episteme to know, arguing for technology as a revelation of truth through craft, kind of known by me. He says techne is a mode of out-of-the-way, unconcealed. It reveals whatever it does not itself bring forth and does not get lighter. So modern technology, he's writing in the 50s, or he's writing in the 40s, so modern technology for him is the hydroelectric plant. Modern technology is machine power and based on physics, but it's also a reveal. So rather than Lopez and poiesis, modern for Heidegger technology reveals. So calling needs to be calling is being that seeks to reveal or transform and redistribute the energy control world. So Heidegger calls this framing, right, a revealing with the aim of controlling and ordering that which is revealed. So before to the history of the science, consult with Heidegger, philosophers understood techne as not direct imitation and at least easier engagement in the natural world. So cut out the examples of this. Heidegger. Heidegger said that at the time of the Industrial Revolution, things changed. Okay, so early 20th century technology moves from being a tool for understanding to a tool for controlling or shaping. Forget about. To illustrate, very famously, this is the example of the old wooden bridge that joins the bank, that joined banks across the river, across the Rhine. So he compares this bridge as a form of technology to monstrousness of the hydraulic turns energy power. So both are technology, but the bridge reveals while the hydraulic brings. Back to David. If we're to leverage technology to subvert the necropolitical order, that has to be in the spirit of revolution. I'm not sure that's what Marissa is doing. There's another shade. I'm not really sure if that's what she's doing, but it might be revealing rather than it might be what Memo is doing. So the tension between revealing and framing helps me articulate the use value of David's theoretical models. So I want to look at this tension I did want to look at this tension in two examples that were beyond the scope of David's book, hopefully inspiring to carry these ideas forward into your own work. But I'm not going to do that because I have a lot of questions that I think would be more interesting for us to dialogue. Hear me talk about, I'll just tell you, I was going to talk about my dialogues on Hammers, installation pieces, Google, and well, migrant lexicon for the different the bodies involved in the illuminating technology. But blah 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 blah. Okay, so these two things then, sandbox, which is the installation piece, and that's along the border. Talk about it later. They offer two answers to David's question. Can technology subvert the necropolitical order? Maybe, not exactly. We can illuminate the necropolitical order. We can mock it. We can temporarily thwart it. Performance of I want to say that, but I'm not so sure. I'm really not sure that writing all this arguably the most powerful technical. But I am really ready to have my mind changed. So with that, I'll shift to some questions. The first of which is, how optimistic are you, David? In an increasingly automated world, critical inquiry and institutions of higher learning are increasingly devalued. How optimistic are you that subversion level of analysis, like what we do, that really happen?
I think I think that subversion, I think that happens. The question is it effective? Right. I mean, for me, that's a question that's kind of going throughout the book. And I think that part of that very unsatisfying final sentence is that I don't know. I mean, what I know is that I guess that if you say that this is going to continue happening in the future, and that means that it's going to continue to be a problem in the future. I think that technology can be used to call things out. I think that it can be used to draw attention. I think that it can be mobilized, especially to very specific causes. I'm actually the third book that I'm working on is looking at this more in depth from like real world instead of science fiction. So taking a lesson of science fiction and applying it in the real world. The science fiction is the real world, but you know,
Yeah.
so like real life activism, digital activism state is what it's about. And so I've been trying to think through this since finishing the book, and I'm getting more and more to the idea that I think that that it depends on the nature of what we're doing. I think that there is, I have recently, like after finishing this book, I've started to think that there is a clear kind of distinction between technology being used for catharsis versus technology being used for political ends, kind of borrowing from Brecht here, right? Where if you have a cathartic, if you're making fun of Enrique Peña Nieto during the presidential election, and he wins the election, were you successful? Or were you just blowing off steam in a politically safe environment? And that's a difficult question to answer, especially when the pre was really, really routed in the election afterwards. But I think that there's, I think that when technology is used kind of in a, when it's used looking more for closure and less for the ambiguities and less to really denaturalize things. And when we denaturalize, we're not going to get that closure. I think that that's where that's where technology can be the most powerful.
Lots of questions, but I wasn't sure how you wanted to structure this.
I think that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's been the thrust of the conversation, and we can jump in. Yeah.
All right.
Can I jump in?
Oh, sure.
So I mean, just following up with your first commentary question, my big question would be then what's not technological? Like if you have such a broad definition, because I mean, you're even saying that guns can be metaphorically, they can be prosthesis. So what's not technology, like in your view, like, can we apply this Robo Sacer reading to any cultural work in Mexico from and Chicanx literature, or like what are the borders then?
I think that the sort of Heidegger really helps with that, because like that framing on like the techne is like truth through craft, right? I think the way that humans interface with the world. But yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so that was a question. I've been asked that question before, and I asked myself the question too, right? I mean, because when you have a really broad definition, and this is Chris Hable's phrase definition that I have found very useful. So I don't know why all these people that I'm citing are independent diagnoses. But anyway, what I find is that when this is the framing, when this notion of cyborg, when it is able to help us to conceive of what's going on, if it helps to shed light on structures of power, if it helps to shed light on modes of resistance, right? In those cases, I think that it's valuable to use that theoretical framework. You know, I mean, you could argue that something from like rural Mexico, 1930s, if you see a person wearing glasses, that is a very important technology because this person has the ability to get something to improve their vision. Whereas in this room, I mean, I think that about half of us at least have glasses on. It seems to be less, I mean, I guess we're all cyborgs, go us, but it's not as useful of a frame. It doesn't provide as useful of a framework or as a way to address questions in this sort of a setting. And so I think that things are very tied to their context. That helps.
Here's this is again, Professor Eagle, this is the portion that's kind of like a statement, but it's a statement in the spirit of I want to hear you respond. So in chapter 4, you talk about, and I'm quoting you, necroliberal technology as a dehumanizing tool that interpolates women into their life. I don't know what you think is different about the necroliberal statement. Women always subscribe to their right, right? Their rights are always curtailed in every kind of state since the dawn of state. So what's different now for women? And my sort of argument here for you is that women's rights, we can think of women's rights as a barometer for the state, the public state generally. So I would say that the thing that's different now is that men are increasingly subject to intrusions all the time. That nothing has changed. But you tell me.
So yeah, so this chapter talks specifically about feminicide in Mexico, and so I think that in that section I was talking specifically about the Juarez murders, right? And you know, in that case, what I would say is that there was particularly in that case, and there was very deliberate action by the state to ignore the cases of feminicide that were happening. There were very clear movements by the state to the state of Chihuahua, the federal state, even the city, the government on down, right? To really just kind of keep the maquiladoras open. They knew that it was women that were the main workers, and they knew that there was significant danger in getting home from work. They weren't doing anything to improve the situation. They were doing that very neoliberal thing where you put everything on the individual. It's like, how do you dress when you go to work? How do you, how did you look at that person? Right? Instead of saying, we've got the systemic problem, it was very much it was very neoliberal in that it was very individual. And there was this idea that when one woman died, and with some of these maquiladoras, it was very often. It was under the year, right? And so sometimes maquiladora would have a couple people that didn't come in, and they would just they had this massive stream of migrants that just kept coming from Chiapas and from Oaxaca, and it's like, okay, somebody died, I can hire somebody new. And the state, there were, and that's where a lot of this is the case where online where activism, not necessarily online, I guess, but activism was very successful, right? Because the phrase "ni una más" got big at that point, and there were pressures put on the government that eventually, I would not say they resolved any problems, but but Juarez is not as dangerous, was not as dangerous 5 years ago at least as it had been in the 90s. Gotten worse, but I think that that in that specific case, looking at these specific cases of feminicide, that there was very much this case, right, where the government was saying, okay, well, we're willing to let these women die. If they're a sacrifice for us to be able to send cheap television to the United States and to keep the economy going. And the ones that don't die, they're gonna have money, they're gonna just spend it all of it.
So it's not necessarily that things are different. It's just like a new version.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I guess I was speaking specifically to that case, but you're it's
It doesn't undermine your argument.
right.
So here's another hard question. I'm curious to you talk more about concepts like rights and talking about universals and sleep dealer.
Okay.
For instance, you say, can they quote celebrate a certain tenacity and spirit, which is a phrase that struck me. And go on to say we can think of Robo Sacer resistance as the newest technology of request. So it seems like for you, the human is a necessary condition of resistance. Like once the status of the place is more than human. So just put it another way, like life for you is human, but you think that non-human life might offer some avenues.
That's a really interesting question. And I think that that's not something that I really explore in the book. I should have put in the conclusion that's something that's an area of future research.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. I mean, I think that absolutely the way that we interact with the non-human kind of fit with the theme of this conference, right? Is it Anthropocene? I always said Anthropocene, but I've heard
Anthropocene. I think it's multiple pronunciations, actually. Yeah.
I find that a lot of my pronunciations of these words are wrong. The Anthropocene. I find that the way that we interact with life, that we devalue, whether that's people that are from marginalized communities, whether it's octopuses, right? I feel really bad eating octopuses because they have very developed nervous systems and they're sentient, and so I feel really bad eating them. But yeah, so I think it's but anyway, but to get at what you're saying, right? This I think that there is the way that we interact with animal life, right? Or plant life. I mean, if you look at Luna Barceros, one of the key points of that is that alongside this destruction of humanity is this destruction of nature, this destruction. I mean, it's kind of problematic, but there's this one spot, Chinganasa in Peru, which is this indigenous Native American stronghold that has nature still, nature and technology. So it's and that's kind of this resistance spot that exists at the end of the novel. And again, it's a little heavy-handed, a little problematic, essentializing, but it really kind of gets at that dichotomy, right, of advancement and like environmental degradation versus a more holistic or more balanced approach to life. Sleep Giver is the same way, right? I mean, people talk about the technology aspect of it, but at the very end, he's growing corn, and they talk about how he's doing something very real. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely a huge connection between this destruction of plant and animal life that goes along with it. You want me, did I answer that well? Is there a little bit more?
Like, is there a fix for that? I mean, that's not what your book is about, but
Right.
this book is about, so I should.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that, and I think there's a valuable dialogue.
Well, I mean, just to, if I may follow up with that, I mean, what I like about, your work in general is like your close readings, they're awesome and very complete. And I'm wondering, like, now that you've finished the book, like, how, what are they concluding? How are they conceptualizing the human? Like, in general, like, are they positing specific characteristics, especially, I mean, after the issues, the resistance of the Robo Sacer? I mean, are there essential traits that in these works you can see, well, the human is this, like, in general, or is it always changing? Like in Sleep Dealer, in Chronos, in Tonight, do you think that there's something deep that they're connected, that defines or that want to define the human as something essential? Because in this conference, we're kind of trying to move away from the notion of essentialism, like the human is, you know, a collective of human and non-human entities. Like, but do you think that they propose an essentialist version of the human, or no?
I think that in these works, at least with the theoretical angle that I use to approach it, I think the human kind of takes this, and I hate Aristotle, like the world would be better without Aristotle, maybe. Just fight slavery and everything. But I think that this idea of the Aristotelian good life, right? This idea of the human as a political animal, I think kind of bubbles beneath the surface in all of these works. We have people that are marginalized to varying degrees in each of these works, and basically what they're using technology for is to be viewed as equals with hegemonic society. And so for me, it has to do with getting that with the politicization of the Zoid that I think that Chela Sandoval kind of drawn attention to, and that I think the book kind of focuses on a lot. So the political.
I have another concept question for you.
Yeah.
If anybody can jump in at any time. You talk about Mexican as a kind of hybridity, or it's like an invitation to all of the Mexicans that wants to jump in. And you said Mexican alongside cyborg theory, and you talk about Paraguay. But many have argued, notably, that Mexican, especially as I think is intentional for you. That Mexican is a kind of erasure in the Latin America. So people call Mexican. It feels like you're using it in those celebratory ways, but we could also think of Mexican as a kind of technology of the state that brings forth whiteness in this sort of Vasconcelos progress of pursuing that.
Well, I think that there's mestizaje, like Mexican mestizaje, and I think there's Chicanx mestizaje, which are very different. So like, I think that Anzaldúa, like the mestizaje that I think I'm the most celebratory of, is more along like Anzaldúa is very inclusive. My first book is all about how evil the Mexican post-revolutionary state was with its imposition of mestizaje and the erasure of indigenous. That's again an overstatement, but it's very. It deals so my first book deals a lot, right, with the ways that technology was in that book. I argue that technology was used as a way that the state used technology to fuse with indigenous bodies and create mestizo actors, and basically as a way to erase what they viewed as primitivity and create a modern mestizo world. And so I'm very critical of kind of these Vasconcelian ideas, for sure. But I think that Anzaldúa with her reading of Vasconcelos, which seems to mostly take Vasconcelos' idea of mestizaje and say this is what it. I think that was it you, Rachel, that said this, that he said that this is what he should have. This is what he should have said. I mean, it feels like that's kind of what she does in her mestiza consciousness paper. Like she's Vasconcelos wrote about mestizaje, and then she kind of gets onto like this, all of these good things that come from it, and all of these kind of intercultural exchanges that can happen as a result of it. I don't think that she's actually doing what Vasconcelos said, but she is getting at the value that one could have gotten from mestizaje.
Do you have any like dog in the fight or thoughts about the critiques of Anzaldúa?
I don't have many dogs in the fight on this one, but I know that they're out there.
Okay.
Yeah, I know there are some problematic issues with her, but
I still teach Borderlands, and I was like, yeah, okay, it's problematic, and it's like, let the students go to town on it, but even she comes under fire, it's still for basically, right, like,
Right.
sort of fetish, Navy, and right, there's sort of Indian, this kind of thing, you're like, it's like,
if we look at, for example, I mean, Smoking Mirror Blues, she does the same thing that Hogan, where
Yeah.
it's like this whole idea of the well, I think it's what state, which says they live in the obsidian and they get transfixed. It's like, and you know this how, you're an authority how.
I mean, you can like bracket Anzaldúa, and you're saying that you understand there's huge differences between mestizaje, cultural history in Mexico and Chicanx. Anzaldúa doesn't have to hold on, but like, how would you work?
You know, for me, I think that for all of her problems, I do think that Anzaldúa, I think that she really views mestizaje as a way for there to be a communion across people that are very different. Racial, not just racially, but also along lines of gender and sexuality, that just doesn't exist for Jose Vasconcelos. For Vasconcelos, it's all about there's this history, and one race is always the dominant race, but they always get stronger by mixing, and we're going to be that race. But then when you look at, and so like, yeah, it was valuable to kind of push against Spencerism. It was valuable to push against some of these very white supremacist ideals. But when you look at how it played out, when you look at what he actually favored, it, like you say, it was very much his very much imposing that. Whereas in the case of Anzaldúa, I think that there's a greater acknowledgement, imperfect as it may be, of a greater diversity, and the need for there to be a communion. I mean, that's where I see that.
I was gonna ask you, what are you trying to?
There was I was thinking about, Agamben for certain, I don't know, biopolitical thinkers does negative biopolitics. And Esposito, Timothy Campbell is one who has a book from Heidegger to Agamben. And he is looking at Esposito and he says, maybe I take Esposito a little too far in saying that actors can act, so sort of subalterns can act against the sort of immunological paradigms of the state, in a kind of tolerance or a kind. I think, you talked a little bit about counter-immunity in your article about zombies and their role. And what I see is that this resistance and pushing against the state, maybe that's a way of strengthening it. I don't know, these little, if it's a push back, I don't know how positive this, counter immunity can be against the immunity. And does that make your immune system stronger? Or are you just sort of playing? It's something that I've struggled with in some of my stuff. So thank you for your intervention on Heidegger, and David, I'll let you take that up. Or maybe that was just a pregunta.
Yeah, didn't talk as much about esposito in this one as I did in my last book. But I think that you ask a really good question, right? And it kind of gets at what I was saying earlier about catharsis versus kind of denaturalization, because I think that cathartic acts could be seen as, I'd said that it was kind of politically safe. And that could be kind of seen as strengthening the immune system, right? Whereas something that's more focused on denaturalizing and just keeping the naturalization going could be something that it's more critical, that it gives the state of fever, destabilizes it, you know. Yeah, I think that.
Well, you can run with it. If anyone can run with you.
And your other question, and the other piece of that was, we're talking about Robo Sacer resistance, but is resistance sort of Foucauldian throwback? Like, is resistance just shoring up the debate? Which I guess that's also sort of what I was trying to open up and asking you about the human. Like, it's the doubling down on the human exacerbate the problems.
Right. I think, yeah, I mean, I could see how it would, for sure. I mean, it's definitely one of those things, right, where if anytime that we're insisting on the constructs of power that exist, then we are wedding ourselves to that stream of thought. And so in that regard, for sure, I would say that insisting on those on similar kinds of categorizations that can be problems. I mean, and this is difficult too, right? Because lots of times, if you want to have like palpable real world change, like in the area of politics, right? It's by taking what's already there and just kind of working through it, right? And getting like a perfect example of DACA, right? Where you have, I mean, there's that whole model immigrant narrative that came out during the aughts that was that it didn't contest a lot of the border security arguments, but what it did say was, we're dreamers, we came as children, not my fault, my parents' fault. No, I go to school, so the guy down the street that didn't go to college, maybe he's not as special as me, but I'm special, right? I mean, and they got DACA out, right? And that was a big deal. But you know, after DACA was signed, then we started getting a lot of pushback against the perfect immigrant narrative, because there were so many people that were left out. And so I think that gets perfectly kind of at your question, right? Where they were, maybe it's not about the humans per se, but it's still about kind of taking those reigning discourses and validating, because that's what they were doing, and that's how they were getting, and they were setting themselves apart from them. And that could be something that happens in a lot of cases.
So here's another, I guess, some kind of similar methodology question. I think we'll do the last question. We have 2 minutes. I was impressed with your equitable citation. It's like lots of women of color. It's great to see that. But I'm also wondering why Alabama then? Reasons why Alabama that you know, you cite Gareth Williams and exceptions using fundamental theorizing politics, but also you know, are there not foundational Mexican thinkers on the same order as Agamben? And I don't know, I'm not a Mexicanist, but I'm wondering if you can talk about this feeling that always nags at me, that in order for my work to be taken seriously, I have to shore it up with you guys.
Right.
There's like a lot of questions in there.
Yeah. Yeah, so the project was born when I was in grad school, and at that point, not everybody knew Agamben yet, at least not in Spanish, maybe they did in English. I don't know, but we didn't know him yet in my department, at least. Like, I talked to all my professors, like, you heard of Agamben? And I was Agamben. It was a little bit ago, not incredibly long ago, And so kind of it was, his ideas on biopolitics were helpful. And then the question on biopolitics in Mexico, there's Gareth Williams, for example, he's written that, Ignacio Sanchez Bravo and, Maduro Moraña have written several books on biopolitics in Latin America. And I do cite them, but again, they're also citing Agamben, or they're citing, but more recently, I think that people have been moving more into the necropolitical and within them so in the case of Agamben, it was really that bios Zoe kind of binary that was really valuable to the project as I was thinking through it from the get-go.
I didn't mean to put you on this test with that, but
No.
some of the other ones, yes, so this one, I'm more interested in how, in the politics of your department, in your field, like, do you feel like, in order for your colleagues to hear this, it's got to be about Agamben and not about Bebe or Ignatius.
Actually, I think that if I didn't cite Nacho, that I'd be in worse shape. Yeah. No, I think that one really good thing about Latin American studies is that there is very much an insistence of citing Latin Americanist thinkers and Latin Americanist scholars. I mean, do we cite Foucault? Yeah, but usually if you cite Foucault, it's like, please tell me you've at least read Foucault in Latin America, so you're citing in a Latin America way. So I do think that the field does insist on being familiar with Latin Americanist thinkers, Latin Americanist thought. Some of these big European thinkers still make their way in, but lots of times, I mean, I'll have Agamben, but I also want to see what other people said about him from Latin America. And yeah, and so do we have to have him? I think this project needed him. I don't have to change the title.
Right.
But I think that there's also very much there really is a strong kind of history of citing people from the region too, and making sure that you're focusing on that as well. That you're not just like using Europeans to talk about Latin America and not explaining why that matters. Thank you.
All right. Well,
Mindful of your time.
thank you very much, Marissa, and thank you, David, for a good